Hello and welcome to the Flix Forum podcast, where each episode we go back and we look at a Netflix original film in the order of release. Today we have Netflix 228th film from 2020. It's the biographical drama Sergio, directed by Greg Barker, starring Wagner Moura, Armas, Garret Dillahunt, Clemens Schick, Dalton, Bradley Whitford, and Brian F. O'Byrne. I'm Jesse. I'm riding solo for this one. I think that's going to be a bit of a regular occurrence moving forward, but I'm excited to talk about this one. This one is a true story. There's nothing wrong with a true story and nothing wrong with hearing about this one. So if you are keen on checking out the story of Sergio, give us a pause. Come back later because I'm going to spoil this film as we go and spoil this story. But you may already know Sergio's story, so that doesn't matter. So feel free to hang around and listen to what I've got to say. And I'm going to kick it off with the Fast Flicks, where we do a quick summary of what the film is all about. So for this one, this story follows the work of a UN diplomat in conflicted nations and the conflicts that he also faces in his personal life. I did not know the story of Sergio. I do enjoy political stories. Didn't know Sergio. Didn't know what had happened to him. So to me, this was a new story, and I thoroughly am looking forward to discussing this one. So for, I guess, a bit of context, this one is actually based on the book called Chasing the Flame, One Man's Fight to Save the World by Samantha Power. And yeah, this is a true story, as I've mentioned, and it covers sort of Sergio and his work with the UN, as well as working alongside another worker called Carolina, and she sort of becomes a love interest for him. I've got to give that little context, I guess, to talk a little bit about how this story came about. So I think that this is going to be so hard. So yeah, I am going to spoil it massively. So the end of the film ends with Sergio dying in a UN building in Iraq. So that's the context behind this film. So Carolina was sort of his lover and co-worker too, and she sort of wrote a piece in the Huffington Post sort of criticising the lack of initiative of the UN to look into this attack in which he died, and bringing those responsible to justice, even though Sergio had been such an asset to the organisation. In the end, he's sort of, they didn't really care, which is a bit sad. She also claimed that the bombing that killed him was never investigated properly, and the circumstances of the incident were buried under statues and memorial speeches. She also then later resigned from the UN in 2005, which is an interesting thing. This, I guess, was filmed, and it covers lots of different countries. We're in Cambodia, we're in Iraq, we're in East Timor, but due to practical reasons that they couldn't actually shoot in East Timor, so the solution was that they bought 24 East Timorese people along with their clothing and fabrics and filmed in Thailand. And then they completed with a lot of extras from Timor who are already in Thailand, and this lady called Senharina was one of the people, and her scenes were based on a real-life encounter that Sergio had with a woman from Central Asia in a refugee camp, which I'll probably talk about in some scenes later on. But the actress had also lost her loved ones in a civil war too, so even though this scene, they were following a script, the dialogue wasn't actually rehearsed, and the scene was improvised, and Wagner Moura, who plays Sergio, he actually did cry during the filming, and that's probably why it's going to end up on one of the scenes that I did enjoy in this film. Also, shortly after the events in this film, Carolina spoke out about the mistreatment from the UN and how they tried to keep her away from Sergio's actual funeral, claiming that they weren't formally married, and they deprived her of rights of being a family member as well as an employee. She wasn't allowed to keep their personal belongings from Baghdad. The UN didn't even call her to testify, and she was removed from the list of survivors from the attack too. Despite the two were engaged, and they had full support from Sergio's family. And their civil union was only legally acknowledged after a lawsuit that lasted over 10 years against his first wife, Annie, who they have kids with. And even after then, the UN still remained silent. So this sort of leaves a bit of a bitter taste in my mouth about the UN, I guess. On Sergio's death, Brazil, his home country, once they heard that he'd passed away, they actually had 3 days of official mourning. That's how big this guy was. I'm so surprised I didn't know about him. as I mentioned before, parts of this film were filmed in Thailand, but also in Brazil, in Jordan, and America. And it probably took about 3 months, according to some sources, to film in 2018. They were going to release this in theaters, but as we're going to see with a lot of films in 2020, the coronavirus outbreak sort of ensured that this didn't happen, which is a little bit sad. The tagline for this film is, "In a world of conflict, he risked everything for peace." I mean, it's a simple tagline. It makes sense. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not anything out of the ordinary, but I guess, it works. Sergio, title of this film, across the world, in Japan, they subtitled it with "The Man Who Fought to Save the World," which is nice. In Vietnam, they just called it "The Prodigal Diplomat," and in Taiwan, they called it "Rescue the Man." So a couple of different titles across the world as well. This did debut at Sundance on the 28th of January in 2020, so a little bit before a lot of the pandemic sort of stuff happened in the Western world. Carolina, the actual real life Carolina, attended this premiere, which is quite nice, before it hit Netflix on the 17th of April in 2020. It was nominated for 2 awards at the IMAGEN Foundation Awards. It won one, it lost one, so Wagner Moura for Best Actor in a Feature Film, he won that award, and the film was also nominated for the Best Feature as well. What are the critics and audiences saying about this film? So, Rotten Tomatoes, it actually is rotten on 44% on 48 reviews, which is interesting. The audience had a little bit higher at 50%. That's on more than 100 ratings. IMDb, a little bit higher at a 6.2 out of 10. That's on a bit over 10,000 ratings. And on Letterboxd, it sits on a 2.8 out of 5 on 7,500 ratings, but it's actually been logged by about 10,500 people. What are my early thoughts? I've probably given a little bit away already, but my early thoughts for this one, I think, as I mentioned, if you've listened to any of our previous podcasts where we sort of cover political, war-torn sort of films, you know I'm a bit of a sucker for these true life stories. And this one got me again. I was fully engaged and drawn into this character of Sergio, who I didn't know anything about, which I've said. And I think the performances in this really helped with that too. So I'm all on board for this film. All right, let's talk about some characters in this one. And obviously, the film is titled Sergio, so we've got to start with Sergio. As I've said, he was a UN diplomat. He worked for the UN for 34 years, I think it was, and he'd given his all to help others. And even though this impacted his own personal life, his kids, as well as his new love, Carolina too, he's righteous in his work, but not necessarily to those around him, as he didn't have the ability to say no or walk away from a job when he needed to or when he committed to doing it. So this is a guy who deeply feels the work that he's doing is impactful, and he's conscious in himself. Like, it's never about what he wants. What does he want? He's always thinking about others through this portrayal anyway. And I think we do sort of see towards the end of the film that he does want to go to Rio. He wants to settle down and he just wants to live life, but unfortunately he doesn't get the ability to do that. And that leads me to Carolina, or Carolina. There's this intelligent woman who is out in the field as well, and she's also helping others, and she falls for Sergio, and their connection is evident through the performances in this film. She probably has a bit too much sugar in her coffee than is needed, but I really enjoyed Ana de Armas in this role. I just feel like the two of them, they just seemed like such good people, which might be a little bit problematic, I guess, because you can't necessarily, like, in real life, people aren't always so cookie cutter clean, but the way that they portrayed them in this film, it was really nice. The other sort of side characters in this film, we've got Gil, who was quite important, a very important role, because he was Sergio's aide, and he was by his side throughout all of the conflicts that he goes through, whether it was Cambodia, whether it was East Timor, whether it was Iraq, he was there. And Sergio says to him, he's like, "You're my conscience," but he doesn't listen to him enough. And I really like the way that they sort of show how that this sort of impacts or brings his downfall, because the end, the end of this film is, unfortunately, Sergio doesn't make it. And if he had have listened to Gil, especially with the idea of getting security for where they were in Iraq, this may not have happened. It was nice too in the credits at the end that we sort of see that Gil as a character was sort of a composite of several members of Sergio's sort of support team, and the character who got stuck with Sergio in the rubble towards the end of the film, I think his name was Losha, and he actually survived and returned to his family. So that's a nice story to finish off on too. We had the character of Paul Bremer as well, who was the American diplomat or American correspondent who was put out in the field. And aside from the news footage of Bush that we see cut in, as well as the CNN reports, he was like the sole voice of America, or the sole US voice that we heard. And this was sort of in conflict to what the UN wanted and what Sergio wanted. So we've got that idea, the conflicting ideas of what was going on as well. The only other character that you could really talk about would be Gabby, who was Sergio's bodyguard, and he followed him everywhere. He was, Sergio would go for a run, and Gabby was there. And he was at the end of this film too, or throughout the cuts, we saw that he was one of those key people who was trying to ensure that he could get out from this rubble. So looked like a good guy too. The director of this film, Greg Barker, very interesting. He was a former war correspondent. He's got 17 directing credits, and a lot of these are docos and real life stories that he sort of would have travelled and seen throughout his time as a correspondent. But this film here that we're talking about was his first narrative feature film as a director, and 11 years prior to the release of this film in 2009, Barker also directed a documentary called Sergio as well, depicting his life and the real events that we see in this film. So Greg Barker has obviously been impacted by the story of Sergio, that, not only has he put together a doco, a real life story of Sergio, he's also adapted this into a narrative feature as well. Now's the time that we talk about some scenes that we liked and we didn't like. So obviously I've said I enjoyed this film. There's a few things that stood out to me. The first one was when Sergio is on the phone to Paul Bremer, the American diplomat that we spoke about, and he sort of says that he's going to talk about the human rights abuses that are happening in Iraq. And, Bremer's obviously not very happy about this. And he sort of, Sergio does like a bit of a phone put down on him, and Gil's there with him as always. And his response was like, that went well. It made me laugh. It was a nice little bit of humor in such a serious moment. And a lot of the moments that we see throughout East Timor, they were really good. Sergio meets with the rebel leader at this stage, and the rebel leader's like, you're just here to fix the solution and those sorts of things. And he has a go at Sergio for wearing this scarf that the rebel leader sort of says is for respected leaders and elders. And it was nice to see later on, once Sergio does all the hard work and actually fixes this, he helps with the solution to the issue that's happening between Indonesia and East Timor. This rebel leader follows up with giving him this scarf, and that was really nice. And again, in East Timor, there's a moment where Carolina organises for Sergio to meet with this local woman, and she talks about her family being dead and wanting to go into the sky to be a cloud and then fall like rain to be on her land forever. And I mentioned this before in the moments that were a little bit improvised, like the crying, the hugs, the realness that you felt in that moment. It was just so nice. And there's a follow-up later on which adds a bit of a comedic moment to it, where Sergio sort of quotes that when he's waiting to meet the Indonesian president, and Gil just sort of says to him, "What the F are you on about?" Or, "What the F did you say?" It was just a nice moment. I also think that highlights Sergio's commitment to his work. There's a scene where he goes back to Rio and he's having dinner with like his family and his kids. His sons are there too, and just the awkwardness between his sons about them, or him not knowing anything about them, especially about an allergy to a food, to shrimp I think it was. And then he just has to bail because he gets a phone call, and he said, "My work's in the field." It was just so sad to see that that's where it comes to, and these are the sorts of people that are making these decisions, that they're rejecting or putting aside their family to try and fix things that are happening in the world. The last thing I'll talk about too, Sergio and Gil, this whole film through flashbacks, we know that they're trapped in Iraq. And they talk about this decision of Sergio to get rid of security in Iraq for them. And just that discussion, it was done so well that Sergio reflects and realizes, he's done the wrong thing. And he's taking responsibility for this decision too. There's only one thing that I didn't really like in this film. And there's this moment when in East Timor, Sergio is trying to meet with the rebels in East Timor. And he's frustrated because he's worried he can't fix it or solve it, because what they want is an apology from the Indonesian president. And then the rain starts, and all of a sudden in the middle of the road in this little town, Carolina and him just start making out in the rain. It was just a little bit lame, a little bit on your nose, and not necessarily needed. We got so much of their love story in this that big moment of them first kissing. I don't know if we actually needed it in a story about such an important man. That sort of frustrated me a little bit. All right, some themes and some ideas in this film. What's it talking about? So obviously, it's about politics. So the idea of meddling in other countries. We see this in every single film that sort of covers war and things like this. But this one focuses a little bit more on the role of the UN and the idea that can they be persuaded? Who's working for them? What are they doing? Are they independent? And what's the cost of war? What's the cost of trying to fix or solve things in other people's countries? Apart from that, the idea of love in this story too. Sergio and Carolina, like, they're people that are going to be together if it's right. If it's going to work, it's going to work, and we see that through their romance too. But the idea of doing the right thing, especially through Sergio and Carolina, they're both very strong people who want to do the right thing. Like, they're very heroic. They're neglecting their family to make the world a better place. It's almost like this idea of righteousness for the oppressed, for the people that can't stand up for themselves. And I know there's that discussion, like, is this the right thing to do? These people are trying to do the right thing. And Sergio in particular, that idea of saying no. Like, how hard is it to say no when you know you can do more, when you think you can do more, when there's that ability that, you know, if I just did this one more thing, can I fix something? And you've got to contemplate that between the idea of others needing you, that there are people in your life that need you too. And that's such a sad thing to see in this film. What did I take away from this film? I think, you know, the idea, like, how good is Moura in this? Like, if you've seen Narcos, you'll know what I mean. But even more impressive, Ana de Armas. Like, she's one of my favorites. I think, like, she's just such a beautiful presence on the screen and just delivers, and like the emotional moments, just the serious moments, everything. And we put out a bonus episode on the Marilyn Monroe Blonde film earlier, or sorry, we're in 2023, but late in 2022. And I think that, you know, I really enjoyed that film. I enjoyed her performance. She's been great in Knives Out. I just think that she's someone to watch, and she's going to be so big. She's just such a great performer. I'm ready to wrap this up. I think it's hard to give this film a rating out of 5 and put it all together. And, you know, as you can probably tell from the discussion, I was fully in this. I think that the skipping between time frames may have been a little bit confusing, a little bit, but the big focus on, you know, the idea that you've got one guy with the support of others trying to help the world. It's just such an important message. I think the love story at times between Carolina and Sergio probably could have been done better, because we probably could have got a little bit of light and shade. Like, we've got a lot of light, but a little bit of shade to these characters too. But I still found it massively effective, and it sort of gave me insight into this character that I knew nothing about. I'm giving this a 4 out of 5. I really rate this film. I think it's worth seeing. So if you've got the time, take it. And I'm really keen to jump on. I think it's on Netflix as well. I want to see the documentary done by the same director on Sergio. I'm just so intrigued by this story. We're on socials. We're on Twitter. We got Facebook and Instagram. If you can, give us a follow, give us a like, share some of our episodes if you can. The question I wanted to put on there for this episode is, like, what are your thoughts on the UN? Like, are they a relevant body in society today? I mean, this is a body that was formed. Like, we had the League of Nations before the UN at the end of World War One, but this is a body that was formed from the victors of World War Two. Are they still relevant bodies to be leading the world today? Has the world changed? Are we in a different situation where we need to say, okay, let's mix it up a bit. Let's change it a bit, and let's do something different. I'm not sure. I mean, people call the UN the toothless tiger, because yes, they can give out messages and say things, but who actually, you know, upholds their decisions? Who actually follows up with what's going on? And as we saw with this story too, based on Sergio's death, not much was done, which is a little bit sad, and that sort of upsets me a bit. But I've enjoyed this film. I hope you will too. I'm back next week for another episode. It's another film from 2020. It's mixing up the genres a little bit, because this one is a computer animated film called The Willoughbys, which is directed by Chris Pern. It stars the voices of Will Forte, Maya Rudolph, Alessia Cara, Terry Crews, Martin Short, Jane Krakowski, Sean Cullen, and Ricky Gervais. I'm excited for that one. I've had this on my watch list since it came out, so I'm very excited to talk about The Willoughbys next week. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for listening to me talk about this film. I really like this film. I hope you give it a chance, and I'll see you next week.